You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. A group of former national security officials has penned an ad in the New York Times opposing the war in Ukraine. Also, China hangs the U.S. out to dry in the Middle East, and elections in Taiwan and Turkey may have an important effect on world affairs. Joining us to discuss these stories and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher, and all-around good guy. Dr. Gerald Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Very interesting, the Eisenhower Media Institute and the Institute for Public Accuracy put out an ad in the New York Times, and they were pushed back against basically, and here's what I think is important, about the narrative in Ukraine. We were told that it was unprovoked. And they actually brought into context NATO's expansion in Europe. I thought it was very valuable, and I was surprised that the New York Times let this thing out. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, no credos or credit to the New York Times. They were paid for that full-page ad, and I guess we should congratulate them for not refusing the large check that they received. But having said that, it is a very important ad, not only because it includes among the signatories Jack Matlock, a former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who was present at the dissolution of the Soviet Union and has reason to be critical of U.S. Secretary of State James A. Baker, who fundamentally, I'm afraid to say, snookered the Gorbachev leadership by speaking orally about NATO not expanding not 1 inch, but not including that in any document. And so, therefore, it's difficult for Mr. Gorbachev and his supporters to claim that U.S. did not hold up the bargain, since it was not in a piece of paper, which meant it was virtually worthless. And the ad is also important because it points the finger of accusation at the military-industrial complex. That is to say, it suggests that NATO is fundamentally a racket. That is, once you expand NATO, you then can compel the new members, such as Poland, to devote a significant percentage of their treasury to buying weapons from Lockheed Martin and Boeing and the other gangsters who comprise the military-industrial complex. I found that to be very revealing. But above all, I think that this ad reflects a deepening rift in the U.S. ruling class about how this conflict is going. That is to say, it's not going very well. You might have seen the Seymour Hersh Substack. You know, of course, that Seymour Hersh is the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who broke the story about U.S. complicity in the blowing up of the Nord Stream gas pipeline. And now Mr. Hersh is suggesting that those we had thought were to be the most hawkish with regard to this conflict, speaking of the Baltic Republic, speaking of Poland, apparently their national chauvinism is overriding their hawkishness, because they are complaining about being deluged by refugees from Ukraine, and they are worried that their treasury cannot stand the strain, particularly since, as noted, their treasuries already are contributing heavily to the bottom line of the U.S. military-industrial complex. So this was a very important ad taken with the latest peace initiative, this coming from African leaders. That is to say, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has rounded up a posse of other African leaders from Egypt and Uganda, etc., to try to press a peace plan in both Kiev and Moscow. And that shows you the state of the world when African leaders are trying to impose or suggest peace for Europe, when I'm afraid to say that the unfortunate stereotype usually goes in the other direction. that is to say, of European leaders of pressing a peace on Africa. That is a sign, I think, of the upside-down world that we're in, which does not bode well for U.S. imperialism, does not bode well for the G7, the U.S. and its sidekicks, including Japan and Canada and the Western European nations, because it's clear that the Ukraine escapade is not going very well. The ad is further evidence of that development, and hopefully the U.S. will be forced to swallow the bitter pill, that is to say, what they consider to be the bitter pill of peace.
Speaking of things that don't seem to be going well for that don't bode well for U.S. imperialism, maybe you could speak on your thoughts of the outcome of the Turkish elections.
Well, it's no secret that the U.S. and its allies are very hostile to President Erdogan. Now, we should be clear that President Erdogan has made some fundamental mistakes, which is one of the reasons why the election was so close, why he only received 49%, and therefore there will be a runoff on May 28th. One of his most fundamental blunders was his effort a decade or so ago to dislodge President al-Assad in neighboring Syria. This went contrary to his then popular slogan, zero problems with neighbors, but it did seemingly align with the predilection of pro-Zionist forces, not only in Israel itself, but in the United States. But then it seemed that President Obama got cold feet at the last minute and did not want to inject the United States full bore militarily, only supplying and supporting religious zealots who would be called terrorists in any other military theater, but were now hailed as freedom fighters. Now, that Syria escapade has not gone very well. We know that Syria is being embraced by the Arab League. It's being embraced by many of its neighbors. Even President Erdogan himself has gotten cold feet with regard to continuous intervention because, quite frankly, given the fact that Kurdish Turkey borders Syria, and given the fact that Mr. Erdogan, in typical nationalist mode, has been quite hostile to the Kurdish population of Turkey, by stirring up trouble alongst the border, he was in many ways helping to encourage a certain kind of Kurdish resistance that he said was his sworn enemy, to the point where he has turned thumbs down on Swedish accession to the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because supposedly Sweden is too pro-Kurdish for Mr. Erdogan's taste. So in any case, despite his being in many ways an attempt to marginalize and isolate him by the North Atlantic countries, he was not defeated, contrary to their wishes. And so therefore you can expect him to collaborate further, I would imagine, with Moscow in turning thumbs down, at least informally, on the sanctions against Moscow. And by the way, this brings me to another reason for that full page ad, which is that I think that wiser heads in the U.S. ruling elite are coming to see that sanctions are not an all-purpose remedy. They are like antibiotics. If they're used promiscuously, it can lead to resistance to their potency, and they lose effectiveness. And you see that with regard to sanctions against Russia. You also see that with regard to countries, not only Turkey, but Armenia and other former Soviet republics, thumbing their nose at sanctions as well, which is one of the reasons why Russian economic growth this year is slated to outstrip the economic growth of hawkish Britain, which has been in the forefront of welcoming Mr. Zelensky. I should also make another point that I'm sure has figured into Mr. Erdogan's calculations, which is that further on this rift in the U.S. ruling elite, recall that Mr. Obama, scorned by many of his comrades because of his reluctance to go full bore into Syria, also suggested that Russia had escalatory dominance, his words, not mine, with regard to Ukraine. And so it would be nonsensical for the United States to do what it is precisely doing right now and illustrating that Mr. Obama had a point, illustrating as well why you had this full-page ad in the New York Times, and illustrating as well why Mr. Erdogan has been able to survive an all-out assault by the NATO forces who were determined to dislodge him from office.
Speaking of elections, you know, Thailand, their #1 trading partner by far is China. China is the #1 investor in Thailand. China is building them high-speed rail. They get more tourism from China than all other countries combined. And now in the election, it looks as though that U.S. proxies may do to them what U.S. proxies are doing to the U.K. and Germany, et cetera. Your thoughts?
Well, the Thai elections were very complicated. On the surface, it represented a classic conflict between royalist forces who were supportive of the monarchy, and I'm speaking of the military that has pulled off a number of coups, squaring off against the national bourgeoisie, that is to say, the capitalist elements in Thailand, many of whom are of Chinese ancestry, as you noted, and they're represented by the man Thaksin Shinawatra, who had been deposed as leader of Thailand some years ago, and then he tried to run relatives up to and including this election. But the military has made clear that no Thaksin supporter or proxy or surrogate will come into power. And so that's led to this present result, which on the surface represents a setback for the military and for the monarchy. But I think it's too soon to rule them out. And I think it's also important to say and to elaborate upon the points you made about China, because one of the, quote, secrets, unquote, of Chinese development over the past few decades is the fact that if you look throughout Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, even Vietnam to a degree, you'll find that the commanding heights of the private economy are controlled by those of Chinese ancestry. And therefore, you cannot begin to understand the rise of the People's Republic of China without understanding this massive inward investment from the Chinese communities in those Southeast Asian nations. Washington historically has shown that it is not adverse to unleashing the guns of conflict against that Chinese elite. Recall what happened in 1965 in Indonesia when you had a bloody coup that led to the death of 500,000 people, many of whom were of Chinese ancestry, not only in terms of the Chinese elite, but also the Indonesian Communist Party, then one of the largest in the world. And that is something we're going to have to keep our eye on going forward. The extent to which Washington, as has been its predilection, will resort to fascist methods to deal with those it considers to be antagonists. Now, one more footnote before we move on. As you know, I'm doing research right now on the U.S. role in Southeast Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries. And just a factoid for those so inclined, the best-known Asians in the United States in the 19th century were the original Siamese twins, who were Thai. Siam, of course, was the older name for Thailand. They were Thais of Chinese ancestry, and they made a pretty penny, a touring with circuses, and wound up becoming slave owners, believe it or not, in North Carolina, where they had a reputation of being quite harsh to enslaved Africans.
Wow.
I'll leave it to you to sort out what that means.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian.